Senator John McCain interview. Take one, soft sticks, marker.
We're near a small town called Cornville up in northern Arizona. It's not too far from Prescott or from Flagstaff, and it's a valley that was settled by the Mormons back in the late 1800s. It's on Oak Creek, which is magnificent, and we have been here for many years. We've grown flowers and trees and built houses, and we've had our kids so many times up here together that it's really it's a part of our lives that is probably we're the most grateful for of our entire family life. It's very flattering, and obviously they've forgotten some aspects of my career in the Senate, but it's very flattering, it's very moving. After I gave a speech in the Senate about the need for us to work together and be together, to have every senator at his and her desk and receive the affection as well as appreciation was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. There is nothing more important than the approval of one's peers, and that's the first time I have ever seen every senator sit at their desk to hear another senator speak. It was deeply moving. I'll never forget it, and I can't tell you that it not only came from my friends, but also from my enemies. You know, I've gone through various iterations of how to address this issue of Donald Trump, not only in his campaign, but as the president. And I've decided that the best way for me is to do my job, number one. Number two, work with the people that he has around him that are old friends of mine, that are great on national security. General Mattis, General McMaster, others that are really top-notch. I work with them well. And as far as a number of the other things that he has done, such as the pardoning of Sheriff Arpaio or these other things, I make a statement and then I move on. My job after 30-some years in the United States Senate is to do everything I can to help the men and women of the military defend this nation under what is, in many ways, unprecedented challenges. Actually, the first clue I had was that I came for a physical, and I was driving up here, and my doctor called and said, "You've got to turn around and come back. You've got a problem." And I said, "Well, it was on Friday. Can't wait till Monday?" She said, "No, you got to come back." That was really the first indication, and I'm very grateful to Mayo. I'm very grateful to all the wonderful caregivers. But most of all, I'm so grateful for the cards and the letters and the phone calls, that not just appreciation, but affection. And it's deeply, deeply moving. And I think I understand, given my family's history and given my experiences, the important thing is to celebrate a life well lived, to celebrate the fact that I was able to make some contribution to the betterment of this nation. Not to look back and figure out all the things I should have done, and there's lots of those, but to look back with gratitude that I've had the opportunity to serve in the military, to serve in the House of Representatives, to serve in the United States Senate, and almost serve as President of the United States. It's been a life well lived. You have interviewed and will continue to talk to some of the greatest people in the world. You will never talk to anyone that is as fortunate as John McCain. Well, he said we've got to operate because we've got to remove what that is. At first, they weren't sure what type of cancer it was. And I said, fine. I said, I trust you. Let's go do whatever we need to do, and let's explore other options and what needs to be done, and understand that this is a very vicious form of this disease. but to celebrate and not to commiserate. You know, my family goes back all the way to the Revolutionary War in military for this country. And my father was a submarine commander in World War II in the Pacific. My grandfather was the commander of the aircraft carriers in the Pacific under Admiral Halsey. So when the war was over, my father brought his submarine into Tokyo Bay, and my grandfather, they hadn't seen each other, obviously came in on the aircraft carrier, and they met the day of the peace signing. And my grandfather said to my father, he said, "It's much better to die for the things you believe in and the country you love." And my grandfather then, after the peace signing, flew home to Coronado. The day he got home, there was a bunch of people that came over, and he went upstairs and died. And to me, my grandfather epitomizes of what service to the country is all about. Well, I love the doctors at Mayo, and I think they're wonderful people. But their recommendation was that I not take the trip because there could be complications from it. And with respect, I said to them, I said, look, there's men and women out there as we speak that are risking their lives and perhaps even getting killed or wounded, and they depend on me to guide the defense bill through the United States Senate. And I just have to go back. I have to go back, and then I will come back and do whatever you want. But this work I have in the Senate is for the men and women, including my own children, that I need to do. So they agreed, and I flew back and arrived when the Affordable Care Act bill was on the floor, as you know. And I gave a speech saying the importance of us working together, of my role models, ranging from Ronald Reagan to Teddy Kennedy, and the importance of us working for the American people, which we are not doing. I also said at the time that I would not vote for that version of the Affordable Care Act, whatever that was. So I happened to arrive on the floor. It was 1:30 in the morning, and they'd been told that I would give a speech, and I did, and the reception was frankly overwhelming. And I was grateful for not just the appreciation, but the real affection. There wasn't hardly a senator in the Senate that didn't come over to hug me. That's pretty interesting in an artificial town. And I just said, thumbs down. And that after, none of that was particularly planned. I had planned on voting against it, and I had announced it. But they sent the vice president over, the president called me, everybody was calling me, and I said, look, I will do anything I can to help, but I cannot vote for this, and I think you understand it. But they wanted to talk to me, the president wanted to talk to me, and so while the vote was extended vote, I just said, look, it's time for me to vote. And I went on the floor and got the attention of the clerk and gave a thumbs down, and the reaction was really phenomenal from both sides. I was born on the 29th of August, 1936, at a naval base in the Panama Canal Zone on the western end called Coco, which, by the way, is now a Chinese container port. In those days, the Navy was very small because of the depression and the shrinkage of the Navy. And there was a submarine base there, submarine division there, and my mother and father were there, and I was born at the hospital there. And interestingly enough, there was some question about my citizenship because Panama Canal was a territory, and guess whose case had been decided that, and that was Barry Goldwater, who was born in Arizona when Arizona was a territory. There's a bit of trivia, and it was a happy time for all of those brave people. But honest to God, in the Depression, the military did not get what they needed, which accounted for, to a large degree, a lack of readiness when December 7th, 1941 rolled around. Well, it was part of a gathering of the McCains because my grandfather, who was an aviator, was in command of the aviation assets in the Panama Canal Zone. Remember, in those days, there was a great fear of the protection of the Panama Canal, which has since passed. So my grandfather and my father and I had that picture together. My grandfather, who was a unique character, who rolled his own cigarettes and loved flying airplanes and wore a very strange hat, but was really one of the great characters in the United States Navy. And that picture was taken not too long after I was born. I still am very touched by it, to see the pride in my grandfather's face as well as my father. They were very close, those two. Well, as I mentioned, my family goes back militarily all the way to the Revolutionary War, including the Civil War. But what I remember a great deal of was on December 7th, 1941, we were in New London, Connecticut. Car pulls up. The executive officer of my father's submarine said, "Jack, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." My father went upstairs, packed a bag, left with his submarine, and the next time I saw him was at the end of the war. And he was in the Pacific, and then he was in the Atlantic, and then in the Pacific. And so I missed out on my father, but I was so proud of what he and my grandfather were doing. But I would also argue that maybe one of the reasons why I was a bit of a, shall we say, rebel, was that I was always kind of fighting against the system. Not so much because I didn't like the system, but I enjoyed fighting against it. As a young man, my father was a very dedicated naval officer. In those days, the only way you could get, literally the only way you could get a commission in the United States military was going through one of the service academies. So they all knew each other. They were all close friends. For example, Admiral Halsey was in the class of 1904. My grandfather's in the class of 1906. There was like 30 members of each class. So they got to know each other very well. My father was very, very, shall I say, admiring of my grandfather. He really had the greatest admiration for him, and they were very close, because my father was gone all during World War II, then came home for a while, and then Korea broke out, and he was gone then. I never got as close to my father as perhaps I would have under normal circumstances. Don't get me wrong, I admired him and all that, but our relationship, though admiring, was not like we went on vacations together or that kind of thing. And he was a dedicated naval officer. He was dedicated to the United States Navy. If our viewers ever are looking for a couple of books to read that describes that period, read Herman Wouk's book, Winds of War and War and Remembrance. It's a wonderful book. It's about the Holocaust, but it's also about the Navy and the military in that period prior to World War II. But so I had admiration for my father. I appreciated the opportunity to be around him. We spent a lot of time together, but there were periods because of his service that he just wasn't there, which placed a much more burden on my mother, who of course is an astonishing person and is 105 years old. Well, her influence was really remarkable. For example, during the war, my father's submarine, he was shifted from a submarine in the Atlantic to a commanding officer of a submarine on the Pacific. She piled the kids in a car, drove across to California, taking care of all of us. She was amazingly strong, and she is beautiful, and she has a twin sister who is now passed away, who is also beautiful, and I think she had a very significant impact on my life. She always was, but yet she also was dedicated to the United States Navy, and she was very good for my father's career because she was sociable, she was helping of him. There's not a exaggeration when we say Navy family. There's a lot to the Navy family. She was devoted to my father and the Navy and did so much to do whatever she could, including basically in many ways raising me and my brothers and sisters, which is not unusual in a military family. But I also rebelled in the aspect that my life seemed to be charted out for me. In other words, he's going to the Naval Academy, he's going to, and I kind of disagreed with that. Just sort of, there's no doubt that I was a rebel and always breaking the rules and always trying to, but to me, it was like a game. Can I beat them or are they going to beat me? They usually beat me. I think there's no doubt that when I believe in something and that I'm really willing to fight for it. And I have done that all of my life. And I have done it whether it be on a major issue such as campaign finance reform or many of the other reforms that I've been involved in, or whether it be just normal standards of behavior, honorable behavior. The American people don't hold Washington and the people who work there in very high esteem. We need to make sure that we give the American people what they deserve, and right now, they're not getting it. And we can decide on whose fault, but right now they're not getting it. That's why I gave the speech that I did on the floor of the Senate. Well, when I was a boy, my mother used to have me spend a lot of time in my room, and I was quite a challenge to her, obviously, but my mother and I were also extremely close, especially with my father being gone so much. So, and I think part of, if we were going to analyze it, was going literally every 2 years from one place to another. There's a transience there that results. But at the Naval Academy, where I was really well known as a real rebel, to me, it was kind of fun. In other words, see if I can get away with sneaking out and going over the wall and having a beer someplace. It was like a contest, which, by the way, as I said, I usually lost. But it wasn't that I was angry at the Naval Academy or angry that much. As well, I said, come on, you guys, let's try it, but on the other aspect of it is, of my temper, which you just made reference to, it was a failing. It was a failing of mine that I was short-tempered. And a lot of that had to do with I'm kind of a perfectionist. A lot of it had to do with immaturity. But frankly, I'm not proud of some of the displays of temper that I was subject to in a number of years. Now, of course, in intervening years, that has subsided to a large degree. And I could go through a whole lot of symptoms of what it was, but part of it is I am in some ways a perfectionist, and I want people around me to be that way, and so therefore when they're not, I get angry. And second of all, immaturity. I was not mature. I wish I could say I was. On occasion, she would put me in the bathtub in cold water. She thought that was a great trick, and it was. But my mother is very loving and warm, and I think maybe if you really look back on it, I think I took advantage of her sometimes because she really was so devoted to me and my sister and brother. But I did learn. I did learn to control better. I did learn to focus better. I did contribute, and a lot of it wasn't easy. And yet, at the same time, I always tried to do better. I am a very, very different person as far as the conduct of my office than I was the day that in January of 1983, when I became a congressman from the 1st Congressional District of Arizona. In my good fortune of being a member of Congress and in the Senate was having the opportunity of knowing two wonderful men. One was Barry Goldwater, who was in many ways our icon, and the other was Morris K. Udall, a liberal Democrat who just, when I went to the House of Representatives, literally took me under his wing, and he taught me more than I can tell you, and he taught me a lot about being a gentleman. And he was widely respected and had a great sense of humor, and Morris Udall was, he was a lot of fun to be around. He always had a great quip or a great saying. Like all of us, you repeat them a lot, but when he was, for example, he was running for the majority, he was a group of young Turks, and they were taking on the old bulls, and they got beaten, and it's a secret ballot. And he came out after they'd been destroyed, and he said, "I'd like to thank the 120 guys that committed to me and the 60 that voted for me." And one of the media guys says, "What'd you learn from this experience?" He said, "I learned the difference between a cactus and a caucus." He said, "With a cactus, all the pricks are on the outside." I mean, he had this great sense of humor that I learned some from, that, you know, if you use a little humor, it really can get some things unstuck. And that was Morris K. Udall, and he and Barry were very close, by the way. Liberal Democrat, conservative Republican, yet they were very close friends. And that was another lesson I got. Mo became very ill his last couple of years in the House of Representatives, and it was a debilitating disease that he had. And so when he had to leave the house, he went over to the VA facility there not far from Capitol Hill. So a lot of mornings I would get up early and just drive out and say good morning to him and help feed him and bring him some clips about what had been going on and read them to him. And by that time he was almost incapacitated, but yet his eyes would light up, and when I'd say such and such happened, read it to him, and you could tell that he valued the visits. And I didn't go there for any reason except that I admired and loved the guy. It wasn't anything but that, and I wanted him to know that there was a few of us, no matter where you are, that still love and appreciate you, and I love and appreciate Morris K. Udall. The other one, Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater, as you know, was in the Senate for a long time. I was new to Arizona, so Barry was not particularly excited about me. We were cordial. But as the years went by, I would go over and see him at his house, which isn't far from ours, and his health began to deteriorate. And his wife, Susan, called me, and she said, "Barry's not doing well. I'm going to call you, and when I call you, I want you to come." So one night I got a call, and she says, "You got to come over." So Cindy and I came over, and Barry was in a hospital bed, but on a picture window overlooking the valley. It's a beautiful scene. And he said, I still remember, he said to Susan, he says, "Am I home?" And she says, "You're home, Barry." And so I was talking to him, and I wasn't positive that he knew, because he said, "Hi, buddy, how are you?" But anyway, so Cindy and I were standing there by the bed, and he reached out and he grabbed Cindy's hand and held on to it and wouldn't let go of it. So Cindy pulled her hand away, and as we left, Susan said, "You know, Barry always loved a beautiful woman," and he died right away. Barry was a wonderful, lovable man who loved Arizona in a way that no one else I have ever known did. Honesty, integrity. There are things, obviously, that Barry believed in that I didn't, and particularly on some of the social issues. But I admired him, and in many ways, I was grateful for the opportunity of learning from someone who, in his own way, is a part of American history. Ronald Reagan has said that the reason why he was president is because he joined the Goldwater for President campaign. So he did have an enormous impact, and in some ways you could argue that he was one of the founders of the conservative movement in the United States of America. You know, one time I was trying to get some kind of clearance, and I had my mom put them all together. There must have been like 15 up until the time I went to high school. And then when I went to high school, I went to a boarding school for the exact reason that they wanted me to go to the same school. And by the way, I didn't take very well to the discipline at the boarding school either. But it was a wonderful school, and one of the great things about that school, it's called Episcopal High School, is they have a strict honor code, which had a real significant effect on me, even at the Naval Academy. Roughly, I would say that there was some like be 2 in a year, depending on where we were and what we went to. I would say probably 10. Okay, if I'm being on the conservative side, I would say that I probably went to 10 different schools. And that's not good, obviously. But it's also the life of a military family. You know, when you join the military, you give up a lot. And so I'm very grateful that we recognize now, so much more than we used to, the rigors of the life of a service family. Not just the individual, but also the spouse and the children. As I was good at athletics to start with, and that was a great way of taking care of some excess energy. Second of all, there was some masters there, particularly one who had been in Patton's Tank Corps in World War II that had a very big influence on me. Mr. William B. Ravenel was a remarkable man, and he would kind of take me aside and he would talk to me, and he would teach Hamlet, and he made me love literature. And there was a strict honor code there. I mean, you can break all the rules you want to, get caught smoking or something like that. But the honor code, if you violated the honor code, you were gone, and you should have been. And so that was an important, had an important effect on me. So that at the Naval Academy, very frankly, I thought the honor code at the Naval Academy wasn't quite as impactful as it was at Episcopal High School. We are surrounded by all kinds of different animals and insects and things. For example, there's coyotes here, there's rabbits, there is deer, there's javelina, and there's lots and lots of different kinds of insects and birds. According to the Audubon Society, in this little oasis there are 68 different kinds of birds, including bats that fly out because of the insects. So it really is a little oasis in the desert with the water and the trees and all that. And we have a wonderful, wonderful pair of Black Hawks who spend the winter in Mexico, come and spend the rest of the year with us, have a baby, have a huge nest, and it is an incredible experience to watch that pair raise that baby hawk. It is one of the incredible experiences you can have in this world. And the interesting thing is, I'm not sure it's the same pair, but a pair comes here every single spring, and they either use the old nest or they build a new nest. And they've gotten so used to us that it doesn't bother them when we're up close to them. And they fish, and they eat insects, and they also eat other birds. These are cicadias. They come out once every, I've been told 6 years, I've been told 8 years, but every certain years they come out and they make lots of noise and they mate, and then they go back into wherever the hell it was that they came from, and we wait another 6 years. So we are hearing this phase of the cicada's life, which is really fascinating. It's really interesting. Personal honor means to me that you are really, at the end of the day, accountable to yourself. You can fool people, you can deceive, but you've got to be honest with yourself. At the end of World War II, my father and grandfather met. My grandfather was commander of the aircraft carriers, and they were going to have a peace signing. My father was a commander of a submarine. He had met a Japanese submarine, put a crew on board and bring it in so that the submarine didn't come by itself. And that afternoon, for the first time since 1941, they were together, and I have that picture. And they talked, and they hadn't, as I said, they hadn't seen each other. And my father told me that my grandfather said to him, there is nothing more honorable than to live a life which you can be proud of when you die. After saying that, my grandfather was on the peace signing the next day, got on an airplane. In those days, it took a couple, 3 days, returned to Coronado where my grandmother was living. There was a big welcome home, and he went upstairs and died. God only knows how I graduated from the Naval Academy. I was, what I would say, not a serious student. I was serious that I didn't want to fail out, and I was serious about number of demerits that I didn't want to get kicked out. But anything short of that was fine with me. And we had kind of a group of us that hung around together, ranging from Chuck Larson, who was our brigade commander, to people like me who were always in trouble. And we kind of hung around together, and we went on liberty together. We was kind of a band of brothers that we had formed up, and we spent a lot of time together, and we enjoyed each other's company. I didn't enjoy studying, and I just knew that what I had to do to get by. And I'm not proud of that, by the way. People talk about, oh, isn't that great? I'm not particularly proud of it. Frankly, I think it was immaturity. And I was fortunate that I had enough maturity that I was able to graduate. But I always knew that I was going to be a naval aviator. So it didn't matter to me where I stood in the class. I was going to go out there and fly airplanes and shoot down MiGs. As a young man and going to the Naval Academy, I was following in the footsteps of my father, my grandfather, my great uncle who was West Point, another great uncle, all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And I wanted to have fun, and I wanted to beat the system and all that, but I didn't want to embarrass my family. I didn't want to embarrass the name McCain by some stupid young man that did something that is embarrassing to his family. So on the one hand, I was the rebel without a cause, but on the other hand, I didn't want for the McCain name to be, shall we say, damaged. But again, at the same time, one of the reasons why I was a rebel is that I had the name McCain, you know. So I said, look, they expect everything you, well, screw them. It's kind of a very much of a two-edged sword, because everybody knew who my father was, everybody knew who my grandfather was, and so they were always kind of watching me. And so I thumbed my nose at them. But at the same time, we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of camaraderie. We were like brothers, literally like brothers. We were together 24 hours a day. We went places together when we had leave or liberty. We spent a lot of time together. There's a closeness that develops in an environment like that lasts till this day. I'll get an email today from one of my classmates at the Naval Academy, usually critical. John, why did you do thus and such? You know, they still have some ownership, and I'm glad to give them that ownership. I am superstitious, and I am unashamed and unabashed to say that, because I don't think there's any reason for me to be alive. With crashing airplanes and getting shot down and being so badly wounded and almost dying, and all of the things that I've been through in my life. And I am superstitious because I've been very fortunate. If there's anything that they will take away from this story, is that John McCain is the most fortunate and the most grateful person that they will ever see on HBO. And part of that is I've been given so many opportunities, so many chances. I wish I'd have done better, but no one believes the story of my life, including me. I enjoy the company of other people. I enjoy learning things. I enjoy the spirit of togetherness. I'm a big Knights of the Round Table advocate. I'll never forget reading that book. I wanted to be the Knights of the Round Table. So I've always enjoyed the company of others. I've always learned from others. And so it's not that I mind being alone, because when I'm alone I read, but I do enjoy the company of others. One of the really wonderful aspects of this beautiful place that where we are now is that we've had the privilege of having so many friends. We have the McCain Institute up here. We have so many family members, so many people, and nothing I enjoy more than to have people or persons or other individuals and families who would come up, stay with us, hike with us, swim with us, and eat with us. So that's sharing is so much important part of my life. And when I was in prison, I was about 2.5 years in solitary confinement, and I learned then to appreciate the company. But I also learned how to tap on the wall, and the dearest friends I have are the guys that I tapped on the wall with, and we kept our sense of humor and we kept our spirits up. And if we hadn't have been doing that, we probably would have fallen prey, or more likely to fall a prey, to the efforts of our captors who wanted us to say bad things about America. She's a wonderful person, and we're close, and we have 3 wonderful children. In fact, they were just up here last weekend, and she's a very, very wonderful person. I think during the period of time that I was gone, things just change, and any responsibility for the break of that marriage rests with me, not with her. Carol is my first wife, and when we were together while I was instructor in pilot training, then I went to a squadron, and then of course that was when I was shot down and captive. Carol is a wonderful person. She was a wonderful mother to our three children. She was loyal and dedicated, and if there's one thing that I regret it, but in the same way, it's one of the things that I'm least proud in my life, and I will always appreciate her. It wasn't hard because I know it was what I was trained to do, and that was my job, and I wanted to, and I volunteered and sought it. And then after the fire that I was on the Forestal, and they came over, because the Forrestal was badly injured because of a terrible fire. We lost 134 young sailors in that fire. They came over to the Oriskany, and they said, hey, they came over to the Forrestal, which was badly crippled. And they came over when we were in Subic Bay in the Philippines, and they said, we need some A4 pilots because we're losing pilots. We need somebody to volunteer. And I don't know why to this day my hand went up, so I transferred immediately from the Forestal, which was going back to the USS Oriskany. Well, in that phase of our operations in the Tonkin Gulf, we were launching what we called alpha strikes. That means a large number of the airplanes would join together and go strike a specific target or targets. Usually you go in cycles of 4 or 6 or 8 or whatever it is, but these were what we called alpha strikes. So we were getting ready one afternoon for an alpha strike, and my airplane was on one side of the flight deck, pointed this way. Look at the flight deck like that. Planes lined up, and then planes faced forward in the rear. There's lots of airplanes because the front is for the catapults to launch the aircraft. So I got into my airplane. It was a brave, wonderful young man named Tom Ott, who was my parachute rigger, which means he had this habit. Every time after the plane was started, I would hand him my helmet down, and he would clean off the visor and give it back to me. It just became a habit of ours. I handed him my helmet, he handed it back to me. On the other side of the flight deck was an F-4 Phantom with a rocket called a Zuni rocket on board. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, but a rocket was fired, and it came across the flight deck, and it went through the fuel tank that under the center of my aircraft, and also knocked some bombs off of the wing into the fire, which then was spreading. I saw the fire all around. I got out of my airplane. If you ever see an A4 aircraft, the refueling probe is very high off the deck. Went out on the refueling probe, jumped and rolled through the fire. This is all on film, by the way, because the filming, and went across the other side of the flight deck. Then I was watching, and I saw another guy, a member of our squadron, that tried the same thing I did, only he fell and rolled through the fire and was on fire. I started to run over towards him, and just then the first bomb ignited, and it was horrendous after that. It blew holes in the flight deck, which is so thick with steel, planes on fire, ejection seat rockets firing off in the air because of the fire, and brave, 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 brave young sailors running into that fire trying to put it out. And as I said, 134 sailors died that afternoon. And again, there's so many stories, but I had shrapnel in my thighs and a few in my chest, nothing bad at all. But I decided I would go up to sick bay much later that day. Like, I think the fire started around noon, and we put it out finally the next day, but it was mainly out. Went up to the sick bay to see the doctor. I said, "Do you want to look at this?" I'm up there, and I walked in, and there were these young people laying there, horribly burned. And one of them said, "Senator McCain," I said, "Commander McCain." And I went over, and he said, "It's me." I won't mention his name. And he said, "What about Mr. And I won't mention his name. He didn't make it, did he?" And I said, "Oh yeah, he made it. I just saw him down in the ready room." He said, "Thank God." Died. I mean, you can imagine. And anyway, I want to get back to the parachute rigger, Tom Ott, who, I forgot to mention his name again, to the parachute rigger, he had just handed me the helmet. So when the rocket came over, of course, we never heard from him again. And he was from Mississippi, and it's been a while, but I corresponded for years with his family. He had handed me back the helmet, and he had turned away, then it hit. And so I've always thought a lot about him, thought a lot about all of those people, and it brings us back to what we were talking about earlier. No one should have lived through what I lived through on that day. And I don't know if it means that there's a purpose, but I do know there's nothing wrong with being a little superstitious. During that period of time, they decided to escalate the air war over North Vietnam. That's the subject of a whole nother program. But we started doing what we called air alpha strikes, which were large numbers of aircraft, and we started striking targets like inside Hanoi, which we had never done before. So this particular alpha strike was going to hit the thermal power plant inside the city of Hanoi, first time we'd been there. And by the way, the day before, we went to the airfield outside of Hanoi, which was the first time we'd gone there. But so we knew it was going to be very dangerous. I mean, there were concrete circles of surface-to-air missiles around Hanoi, every 10 miles or so, closer and closer. And then in Hanoi, it was an incredible number. So we briefed up on it, and I'll never forget, one of my dear friends said, "Hey, John, you better be careful on this one. This is pretty dangerous." And I said, "Get this, don't worry, they'll never get me. So anyway, we go in and they suppress the flak, and then with the fighters, and the other fighters are above in case of MiGs, and then the attack planes, of which I was one, called the A4, do the actual dropping of ordnance on the target. So there was probably 30 airplanes in this strike. And as we came in, of course, it was the 4th of July. Missiles flying everywhere. I think we lost 6 planes that day, as I recall. So we headed in, and I saw our apparatus tells us when a missile is headed our way. And that's not so bad, but when there's a whole bunch of missiles, you're not sure which one. So anyway, we were headed in, and I got over the target and rolled in. And just as I released my bombs, and I was in a steep dive, a missile took the wing off the airplane, which of course sent it into a very steep and fast spiral downward. So I then ejected by pulling the ejection handle. It's hard to know how fast I was going, but it was awfully fast, so that when I hit the airstream, it broke my arms because of the going out in the airstream, and also hit my leg on the console as I went out, breaking my leg. So, strangely enough, I landed in a lake in the center of the city of Hanoi that's called the Western Lake, and was able to, both my arms were broken. I was able to get the inflator on my life vest and floated to the top. And you'll see this picture of them coming out and pulling me out of the water. And they were not happy. We just finished bombing their place. And so when they got me up on the ground, one of them stabbed me with a bayonet, and another one smashed my shoulder. But then some army came up, and they put me in a truck and took me to the prison, which was a brief 5-minute ride from where I was shot down. The injuries that I experienced were severe, with broken bones, and they put me on a stretcher in a cell in the prison camp that we called the Hanoi Hilton, which was the old French prison. And for a couple, 3 days, as far as I can remember, they would come in and give me some tea or something like that. So they said, we'll give you medical help if you will give us information. I said, I can't. Well, anyway, I believe it was the 3rd day. They had a blanket over me, and they came in, and the guy pulled the blanket up, and my knee, I could see, was just huge. And I said, okay. I said, you take me to the hospital and get me fixed, and then I'll give you information. And so, which was what we were trained to do. So they put me in my stretcher, took me to this, what they called the hospital, in a very small, damp room in the hospital. But they did put a chest cast on me. This arm was broken in 2 places, put a chest cast on me, and they started feeding me. And yet, I still wasn't getting much better. And one day the interrogator, which is another story, the head interrogator came in and he said, our doctors tell me that you are not getting well. And I said, well, look, I'll tell you what, you take me and put me in with some Americans and I'll get well, okay? And he said, okay. And that night he left. And then about a few hours later, the interrogator came in and said, your father is a big admiral. And I said, yes. He said, we're going to take you to the hospital. And that was when they picked me up and took me to the hospital. And the reason why they knew it is because the Hanoi Hana, their propaganda radio, had broadcast that John McCain, the son of Admiral McCain, was a prisoner. So then they took me from there into a room with 2 other people. Bud Day, who was an Air Force major, wonderful guy, Norris Overley Air Force guy, and they literally nursed me back to health. They were sure that they had the Vietnamese had put me in that room because they wanted me to die there rather than in the hospital. And those two literally nursed me back to health. And it was miraculous, and yet the love and affection that both of those guys bestowed on me was something I will never, ever forget. Well, I believe in love, and I believe that there's such a thing as shared values, shared goals, shared experiences, and shared kind of things that we believe in that bring us closer together. When I was in a squadron with 16 pilots, and you all get very, very close together, and it is a form of love. And it isn't always fun. And there are jerks. And there are, it's not the Bobbsey twins at Paradise Lake. But there's also relationships that you build up which are forever. My father was the commander. After I was shot down, he was made commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific based in Hawaii. And when he was told about it, and my mother was told about it, they decided that they would not discuss it with anyone. They discussed it with each other and with any intelligence information that may have come out. But everybody that came to see them, the request was, please don't talk about McCain's son, because it's just, they prefer not to, which I thought was the right thing to do. But it was very hard. It was very hard on them, as you can imagine. So anyway, my parents were extremely strong and brave, and my father carried out his duties. And again, except for intelligence briefings, he did not, nor did my mother want to talk about me. And I think that was the best way to handle it. And I'm proud of the job that he did under certain pressures, as you can imagine. We were treated well, the three of us. In other words, they didn't bother us. And then they gave me a crutch, and I was able to get up and walk on a crutch. And that was a mistake, because as soon as they found out I could walk on a crutch, the next day I found myself alone in the cell. And for a period of time, I would say 6 months, they basically left me alone. And then one day, I was taken up to interrogation room. There was a guy there. I had seen him when I was first shot down. Erudite, spoke perfect French, perfect English, was one of Ho Chi Minh's #1 guys. And he sat down, and there was cigarettes, and there was tea, and it was a very friendly conversation. It went on for an hour or so. And finally he said to me, well, everybody wants you to go home because the doctors say that you can't live. And I said, well, I don't believe that. I believe I can live. And I said, our code of conduct says that we go by order of capture. He said, except for sick and injured. And I said, but I'm not that sick and injured. I'm getting better, I can get around, etc. And I said, and I know what this is. I know it's for propaganda, and I'm not going to provide you with propaganda. About 4 days later, back up again, same routine. Your family wants you home, your parents want you home, everybody in America wants you home, you could be doing, and I just said, I just don't think so. I just don't think so. I went back and tapped on the wall to Bob Craner, who was a guy next door, Air Force Major, and we went back and forth, and he said, maybe you should take it. And I said, but what am I going to say to the families of those who are here? Anyway, finally, the last meeting was on the 2nd of July, and I went into one of the regular interrogation rooms. They had a stool, the cat, as we called him, sat in there, and I was fascinated because he had a copy of the New York Herald Tribune on the desk in front of him, and he had an ink pen, one of those old kind of ink pens. So he said, we want to know your final answer. I said, as I told you, I can't. That's my final answer. And he took the ink pen and he broke it, and ink spread all over the newspaper. And he kicked over the chair behind him, and he turned and he looked at me and he said, "They taught you too well," and walked out and slammed the door. So leaving me and one of the interrogators in dead silence for about 2 minutes, and he said, "Things will be very bad for you now, McCain," and went back to my cell. About 4 or 5 days later, they released these 3 Americans. There's a lot of publicity. Nobody bothers me. And then about 3 days after that, they took me over to the interrogation room, and the fun began. And they were really, really rough. And I mean, to the point where they re-broke my arm. They did all kinds of stuff. But I wasn't gonna give in, and they beat me so, it was so bad that I thought I was gonna die, and so I wrote out a confession, a war crimes confession. And I will be ashamed and embarrassed about that for my whole life. It was stupid. In other words, I wrote it in a stupid fashion, but I'd reached I thought if it continued, I was tied up in ropes in a way that I won't bother to describe, that I figured I was going to die. And so I wrote that, and then they left me alone for a while, but then it was rough for a couple of years. But the word spread throughout my camp that I had refused, and there were some others then that were offered it later on that also refused. The instructions that our senior ranking officers sent out to us: resist as long as you can, but do not break. In other words, if you have to sign something or write something, do it before they break you. When they break people, then all they got to do is go to them and say, "Do this, do that, do this, do that." And unfortunately, that happened to some of the POWs. So when I knew that I was just about to break, I said, "Okay, all right," and then they were okay for a while, but they keep coming back. I thought about the honor of my family. I thought about the fact that they had now on record a confession from a United States Navy pilot. I was aware that they were going to use it for propaganda purposes, obviously. And frankly, if it had not been for the senior ranking officer and several of the others that I was in communication with, they said, "Look, you did the best you could. You did the best you could. You came out of it with a broken arm." And so they bucked me up, and said, "All of us are proud of you." When I say I was suicidal, and when I wrote that, I was so sometimes embarrassed because of what I had done by signing it that I thought about it. But I really, honestly, thought the best thing to do was keep up the fight. Let me put it this way. I was so ashamed that I had written that confession that I contemplated saying, but I never really got, frankly, very serious. In fact, in most respects, I got to hate him even more, so I was a better resistor than I'd been before. When it was put in all perspective, and I talked to the senior officers, and I talked with people, they said, "Hey, they broke your arm, and our code of conduct does say that you hold out to the best of your ability." None of them thought that I had. But look, do I think it's one of the bright chapters in my life? No. Solitary confinement's great strength is it makes the person feel alone. And when you're alone, then you don't have the encouragement, the camaraderie, the strength. There's a reason why throughout history they have used solitary confinement. And I was caught tapping on the walls to, I think it was again to Bob Craner. So they took me and put me in this cell that was away from all the other cells. And it was very small. It was about 7 feet by 3 feet, as I recall. And it was in May, and it gets very hot in Hanoi in May. And they fed me less and all that. But they didn't punish me that much. They just left me alone. A couple of times they took me out for interrogation, but not the real serious kind. And so I lived there from May until October, I believe it was. I'd been in solitary confinement, but I'd been in contact with all these guys. This one I was I was by myself. It didn't make me any weaker or make me want to do anything different. But if I had been put in solitary confinement when I first got there, I think it would have had a weakening effect. It's like we hear about prisoners. You get tougher and tougher, you know. I was a lot tougher after 5 years than I was the day that I was captured. So then in October, they took me back and put me back in my cell again. But again, being in solitary confinement and being able to communicate with others is tough. But being in solitary confinement and not with others, it is real tough. And of course, the weather was so hot. There was only a small hole at the top of the cell, so you can imagine how unpleasant that might be. When I was put in with Bud Day and Norris Overley, they were in contact by tapping with one of the Air Force officers who had gone to survival school, escape and evasion school, where they taught this tapping. And so it spread that way throughout the camp complexes, and everybody then knew about, and it isn't just tapping, it's if they ask you to brush the floor, you brush the tap code. It's really quite remarkable. And it lifts up your spirits. It lifts your spirits. I can tap to you faster than I can talk. Well, President Nixon had known my father years before when he was the legislative affairs officer for the Navy to Congress, and he had gotten to know him then. And my mother's sister was married to a guy named Bert Andrews, who was head of the New York Herald Tribune in Washington, D.C. So they'd known each other socially for a number of years. And Nixon, for all his faults and all the things we know about him, was very attached to the military. He had a real attachment and belief in the military, especially, of course, during those times, because the military was telling him we could still win, etc. Which, by the way, they did not do him any service by the way they conducted or allowed for that war to be conducted by McNamara, which is the subject of another program. But so Nixon had a family kind of relationship also, not really great, but knew him and had worked with him. So when he would fly out to Hawaii, to my father's headquarters, and then on to someplace else, my father would always be with him. And I've got to say that when we came home, Richard Nixon was very emotional. Okay, everybody paints him as the unemotional, etc. He was very emotional, and frankly, I will always appreciate the fact that he decided to bomb the hell out of Hanoi. Otherwise, I might still be there. President Nixon referred to my father as a little admiral, which is understandable, and he did have a lot of affection for my father. They'd go out to these meetings, including like at Guam or Midway. My father would always be with him, and where they would plot the situation in the Pacific, and my father liked him. He was a cigar smoker, which to this day I can't stand. We knew that something was going on, in that there had been kind of a way, almost a pause of the bombing anywhere around Hanoi. And then one night, all of a sudden, all the sirens went off everywhere. Sirens went off. And we were in a big room of that time with like 25 in each room. And we had sort of a grill work that you could see. And you could see these missiles going up. And you could see when a B-52 got hit, and it would burn from 30,000 or 40,000 feet all the way down. And the next day, they continued with tactical air. And I still remember one of the strings of bombs landed very close to our cell. And the North Vietnamese were panicked. They were panicked. And by at least the fourth or fifth day, they weren't firing any more surface-to-air missiles. They were all taken out. It was like a milk run. And they continued to bomb them. And obviously that then was the catalyst that they reconvened or made some progress in their negotiations and brought about the end of it. But it was something to see when strings of bombs are going off, when planes are being shot down, when surface-to-air missiles are flying up in the air, and we loved it, and we applauded, and we cheered, and the Vietnamese hated it when we were doing that, and we sang the Star-Spangled Banner. So we knew that if they really hit them hard enough, that it would change the status quo, and the status quo was limbo. And it was very hard on him, and yet at the same time, there was never a doubt. You know, it was hard on him, and he was, worried and all that, but he also knew that there was a whole lot of other fathers of sons who were in there with me as well. So he was very straightforward about it, and he had always advocated that if you want to wrap this thing up, you're really going to have to go at them hard. And so, they were doing what he'd been recommending for a long time. Every Christmas he would fly to Vietnam, and he would go up to the DMZ, the border between North and South Vietnam, and have Christmas dinner with the Marines. And then he would kind of walk towards the DMZ. But every Christmas he went, and he loved having the Christmas dinner with the Marines. There's a wonderful picture that I'm sure we're going to show that of him with these Marines, all of them. Remember, 17, 18, 19-year-old kids, just remember that, who had been drafted, and they're all smiling and they're all happy. And it was really therapeutic for him, and he just loved to do it. But at the same time, he had the emotion also of not knowing exactly what I was going through. But it's hard to describe. But we have talked before about the military heritage of my family. And yes, he was worried about me, and yes, he was concerned. But the fact is, he knew that McCains were doing what McCains were bred to do. And if it takes you into harm's way, that is our profession, the profession of arms. And I know that that was of some comfort to him. Talked a lot about it. He talked a lot about it, and he told me about what was going on from his side of the situation to, how the decisions were made. You see, when you go for 5.5 years without any information, you become a glutton. I wanted to know what happened. Everybody said they wanted a steak. I wanted to know what Time Magazine or Life or Newsweek or U.S. News had said. I wanted to know what happened during all those years. And so, talking to him, obviously, I had an insight into the whole Vietnam situation. So we spent a lot of time talking. Christmas time, we would they would give us one decent meal for, and it was decent. It would be a piece of turkey and some, I think, a vegetable. We would have one of our POWs dressed up like Santa Claus, and everybody would have to go up and one by one and sit on Santa Claus's knee and get a present from Santa Claus. That was our Christmas celebration then, and it was wonderful. My dad went up at Christmas up to the DMZ and had Christmas dinner with the Marines, and then walked up towards the DMZ to contemplate, and then came back and saw the Marines launched an artillery strike in my name, in my name, to let them know that Admiral McCain was there. He would have the Christmas dinner with them, and then after the dinner, just before he would fly out, he'd walk some distance away up by himself and towards the Hanoi and towards North Vietnam and contemplate things. And obviously it was very emotional for him. And yet at the same time, he came back, and here are all these young Marines, just wonderful example of America. So it wasn't so depressing for him as it was sort of sustaining and invigorating. After the bombing stopped, we did the period for about 2 weeks of bombing, then all of a sudden it stopped. And then a few days later, all the prisoners in each of the camps were called out, and we stood in ranks, and this was part of the agreements that the North Vietnamese agreed to. The CO, commanding officer of the camp, read off the provisions of the settlement. And one of the part of the settlement is prisoners will be returned by order of capture, etc., you know. So we knew that it was over, though. The guards had acted different, the food had gotten better. I mean, it was obvious that it was over, but it was nice to hear. So then we went back to our cells, and they were released in groups. There was 4 groups, each by order of capture. First group captured, second, third, fourth. And so they fitted us for shirt and trousers, and very high quality. And everyone had one of those on, and shoes. And so but then they kept them until the day that we left. The day that we were leaving, we went outside and put on the pants and shirt and shoes, and got on buses and went out to the airfield. And we got off the airfield. We stood in ranks. They said our name, named it, went, and there was an American waiting to take you to the airplane. It was very emotional in many respects, but at the same time, I hate to tell you, but it was almost anticlimactic. Been waiting so long for it, you know. But there was one kind of interesting anecdote. While we were waiting these few days before we were out, they said, "McCain, come in, we need to talk to you." So I went into this room, and there was about 8 Vietnamese in this room, officers, and they had a tape recorder. And they said, "McCain, you are going to be leaving now, and we saved your life, as you know. Don't you want to have a parting message of thanks for the doctors who took such good care of you?" And I looked at them, and I said, "You want me to thank the doctors?" They say, "Yeah." Well, first of all, I'd like to say, where the have you been for the last 5 years? Could I say that? "No, McCain, go back now, leave." And so that was kind of a funny part of the ending. But I want to fast forward again. I went, when we were doing the normalization of relations, I got to know very well the deputy foreign minister, a guy named liaison, and he was the one that did most of the negotiating on the accounting for the missing in action. So I got to know him very well, because General Vesey and John Kerry and I went back and forth many times on different cases. So I really got to like the guy, and he was reasonable, and he wanted to get a result. So I said, look, if this thing is ever over, I said, when it's over, I said, you come to Washington. I said, I'll take you to lunch in the Senate dining room. And he said, fine, I'd like to. Well, the previous 2 Christmases, they'd been playing Christmas music. Every cell, I was in solitary, every cell had a loudspeaker, and they would play, since it was Christmas, wonderful Christmas songs like I'll Be Home for Christmas and others. Well, about 11 o'clock at night, and I'm in this small cell, the door opens, and who comes in but the cat, the same guy who had offered me the release 5 years before. Comes in, he's got a suit on, he's got a little stick pin, he's got a cigarette holder, a thing, opens it up, gives me a cigarette. How are you, McCain? I know I haven't seen you. And he starts talking and talking and talking. Talked about how his father was a rich guy and he joined the Viet Minh and how close he was to Ho Chi Minh, and on and on and on and on. And he said, and by the way, he said, Ho Chi Minh has an island off of Haiphong where he used to go to contemplate. It's flowers, it's beautiful. It was Ho Chi Minh's island. And I said, gee, yeah, that's great. Yeah. He said, yes, my father and I used to go out there. I said, fine. Anyway, we go on, and he stops at the door, and he said, you should have taken our offer. And I said, I don't think you'll ever understand why I didn't take your offer. And he paused a minute, and he said, I think I understand better than you think, and left. Okay, so we fast forward again to Liaison, the deputy foreign minister. We're having lunch in the Senate dining room. He's a very pleasant, he'd been in Paris with Le Ducteau. And so we're talking, he said, now look, the Vietnamese people really now respect you because of all you've done. He said, whatever you want to do in Vietnam, you tell me, you can do it. And I said, that's interesting. I said, I want to go to Ho Chi Minh's island. He said, what? I said, I want to go to Ho Chi Minh's island. He said, nobody knows about Ho Chi Minh's island. He said, how would you know about Ho Chi Minh's island? I said, well, one night on a Christmas Eve. And he said, and I said, that's where I want to go. About 3 months later, Mark Salter, Sidney McCain, John McCain go to Haiphong, get on a boat with some other Vietnamese, go to this island, which is by then run down, and go up to it had three buildings on it, went up to Ho Chi Minh's bedroom, stand at the terrace, and watch the sun go down on the Ho Chi Minh's island. Now that is a great story. And so I've always, and I used, by the way, he's since passed away, but I used to see him quite often. He was a very decent guy. First of all, going home was something that we'd looked forward to for so many years. In some ways, it was almost hard to believe we were going to do it. And of course, we had news and information. But think of yourself going 5.5 or 6 years with only information provided to you by your communist captors. So there was a lot that was going on that we wanted, obviously, to know about. Everybody takes this kind of activity differently, but I just wanted to know what had happened. I wanted to know how the anti-war movement began. I wanted to know about the flower people. I wanted to know, there was a hell of a lot of things that happened between 1967 and 1973. And of course, we weren't really prepared for the warmth of the reception. The POWs had emerged, I'm sorry to say, I'm terribly sorry to say, were the only heroes of the Vietnam War. The average Vietnam veteran was not well treated. That's a shame and a black mark on American history. And thank God we are honoring those who are serving today. So we got to the Philippines, had 3 days there, had good food, talked to our friends, family, read things and all that, and then went to the various places where our families were. different groups of us. And of course, my family was living in Jacksonville, in Orange Park, Florida. So I went back there, and it was wonderful. I mean, the band was there, everybody was cheering, everybody. I felt a little bit guilty because so many of our other Vietnam veterans coming home did not receive that kind of welcome. And then it was kind of a blur because you're at very slow speed when you're in like a prison existence by yourself, and then everything accelerates. And so I went around and spoke to the Rotary Club, went out to the base, and also got a number of medical things, operation on my knee, tooth, various things that I was taking care of. And then I wanted to get back to the business. And I had a flight surgeon who closed his eyes to several disqualifying physical problems that I had, and I was able to go back to a squadron, be the commanding officer of a squadron, which is what I always wanted to do. And again, the period of adjustment was not as hard as you might think in most ways. In a couple of ways, because the world and the United States had changed, it was sort of adjusting to the United States more than the United States adjusting to us. You see what I mean? And when you look at the flower children, when you look at all the upheaval, the anti-war movement, all the racial difficulties, and of course, the incredible upheaval caused by the Vietnam War. So there was a lot of things that we had to adjust to rather than them adjusting to. I can do everything I need to do. I can't bend my knee more than about 90 degrees, and this shoulder and that. But none of it is in any way debilitating in that I can't, do everything that I need to do. I've been very fortunate, and very fortunate to have good doctors, especially when you have a bone broken in 3 places, and it heals up. That's pretty miraculous. We looked out from the terrace and we spent the night in Ho Chi Minh's villa. I mean, can you believe it? But there's a whole lot of things I can tell you. But if you and I went to Hanoi today, I am more recognized in the street in Hanoi than I am in Phoenix, Arizona. I mean, it is unbelievable. The last time I came, there were billboards all over Hanoi, my picture, "Welcome back, John McCain." It's truly amazing when you think about it. Yeah, I go back. I try to go back for reasons that there's a reason. When we were doing this issue of normalization, I went back a lot. But Ha Long Bay is one of the most beautiful places on earth. Hanoi is a charming city. I don't care much for Saigon. It's just a modern city. But I always enjoy going back there. Must be 10 years ago now, I took the whole family and we started in Saigon and we went all the way up to Hanoi. I just wanted the kids to be able to see the whole countryside. And it is a beautiful countryside, as you know. I took them on the train from Bangkok to Mandalay, and we stopped at the bridge over the River Kwai, and the British leave them where they lay, and so we're walking through these gravestones. One of them says so and so's name, etc., known only to God, known only to God, known only to God. I mean, at least 3/4 of those graves were people who obviously, and there was the train, and then to top it all off was a group of about 25 obviously veterans of that war that were there. Most of them in wheelchairs, others in crutches, and they were standing there together, and I'm telling you, it makes you cry. I think one of the most underrated actors in history is Alec Guinness.
Yeah, it really gets
you know. I mean, the guy made some fantastic films. And William Holden, of course. One Christmas, what we did was, I was the movie officer, so I had to tell movies in the room, you know, and I'd have to make up movies, because after a while I told all the movies I have to make up movies. So Christmas time, we did Stalag 17, and you know, of Christmas and Stalag 17. They loved it. They loved it. We did the whole movie. We had one guy as William Holden. We had another guy as the senior ranking officer. We had another guy as, you know, the one that was dancing, you know, the funny guy, the heavy-set guy. I had all those roles, and we played the movie, you know. And it was easy because we didn't have to have any clothes. But that was fun. Keeping spirits up by keeping sense of humor is one of the most important keys to success. And you know, it doesn't matter. There's a whole lot of things to talk about. But now that we talk about it, I think about it. But honestly, I don't think about it anymore. I mean, I'll think about it in a pleasant context, but it's not that I don't think it in either way. I just don't think about it. Somebody asks me, I tell them. But for a long time, I got tired of telling about it, you know? Well, every Christmas that we were together, which was 2, when everyone was together, we tried to celebrate Christmas as much as we could, make presents for each other, have Christmas carols, wake the days before Christmas. It was a great diversion, and we were fortunate in our room to have the former choir and glee club director at the Air Force Academy, and we had several guys who had sung in choirs and glee clubs. So we really had a professional group that were singing, and they practiced. Of course, they had no one else to practice. But come Christmas, I mean, it was really very exciting and fun, and it wasn't being depressed or sad away from home because we had made such a festive occasion out of it. So that was really kind of neat. Just shows if you get a whole bunch of pilots and crammed into a room with nothing to do, they might do something right. Mike Christian has been an inspiration to me ever since I have known him. As I mentioned before, we spent a long time either separated, single to a room, or 2 or maximum 3 to a room. After about 4 years, they changed the treatment and put us into large rooms with, say, 20 or 25 in each cell. And by the way, the treatment changed. The beating stopped, and there was clearly a change in policy towards the prisoners. Well, one of the prisoners that was in this big room with me was a guy named Mike Christian. Mike came from a very poor family in southern Alabama, and he was enlisted, and then he was able to become an officer and a bombardier navigator in the A-6. I mean, one of the great American success stories. And Mike appreciated the opportunities of serving in the United States military. Well, he was shot down and captured a short time before I was, and was put into the cell system. Well, it happens that when we were put in a large room together, Mike was put in with mine. At that same time that I mentioned, they gave us at Christmas some small packages from home, like a handkerchief or a bar of soap or something like that. Some of us they gave them to. And so Mike Christian was able to get a hold of a piece of cloth, red cloth, a piece of white cloth, and we wore a blue shirt and trousers, by the way, sandals that were cut out of automobile tires. I recommend them very highly. Well, Mike got a piece of red cloth and a piece of white cloth, and on his blue shirt, he sewed the American flag, so with a bamboo needle. Every night before we would have our bowl of soup, we would put Mike Christian's shirt on the wall of the cell and say the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, saying the Pledge of Allegiance is not the most exciting part of our day. Saying the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag and country in those circumstances was really important. Well, one day the Vietnamese came, as they did periodically, searched our cell, found Mike Christian's shirt, removed it, and that evening came to the door of the cell, called for Mike Christian out, closed the door of the cell, and beat him rather badly outside the door of the cell for the benefit of all of us, and then threw us back in. Well, he was in, they'd beat him up pretty good. His eyes were swollen and he was bleeding some. And anyway, we tried to clean him up as well as we could. The room in which we lived was a concrete slab, large, and lights that shone in each corner of the cell. Well, after we cleaned Mike up and we all went down and to go to sleep on the slab, I happened to look over in the corner of the cell, and under the light bulb, with a piece of white cloth, a piece of red cloth, his bamboo needle, his eyes almost shut from the beating that he had received, was Mike Christian making another American flag. He wasn't making that for Mike Christian. He was making that for us because he knew how important it was for us to have the ability to pledge our allegiance to our flag and our country. I will never forget Mike Christian and that act of selfless patriotism that meant so much to all of us. I'm a religious man. I believed in prayer. I believed that I'm the most fortunate person on earth, and I don't think it all happened by accident. And it mattered. It mattered particularly in times when things are really tough to pray, and I believe that I was granted some relief from pain. I may be wrong on that, but I thought it was important. I thought that once we were in the big cell that we were in, that we had Sunday church services. We had a big fight with the Vietnamese about that, and it was very important to us. And I don't mean that it's the fair weather sailor. I mean that it becomes important to us, as important as the bonds that were forged amongst us. The individual that when we started these negotiations on trying to identify those who are still listed as missing in action, an individual named Lê Mai, who was the deputy foreign minister of North Vietnam, was the one we dealt with. He had been with Le Duc Tho in Paris, very erudite, very intelligent, and easy to work with, to the point where I got to like the guy, and I said, look, if we settle this issue and we become friends again, normalize our relations, you come to Washington and I'd like to buy you lunch. And so a couple of years later, the normalization took place and all that. He came to Washington and we had lunch together. And he was very friendly and all that. And I told him the story that I just related to you about Ho Chi Minh's Island and having dinner sitting in Ho Chi Minh's room on an island that nobody had really heard about. It's one of the neat experiences I've had. It was at a town hall meeting in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, and of course it was the primaries, and we all know the importance of New Hampshire, how a small state can shape who the next president of the United States is. And at the town hall meeting, there was several hundred people, and a woman stood up and she said, I'm from Wolfboro, and she said, my son was just killed in Iraq, and I want you to promise me that you'll do everything in your power to make sure that my son's death was not in vain. I was deeply touched by it. I saw her afterwards. I bought a bracelet then that I've been wearing now for 11 years, and I will always wear it, and I will always think of her and the courage that she showed at that moment. You know, when there's something like this happens, eventually people get over it. The wives, the husbands, the children, all those. The ones that never get over it are the mothers. And she's there in Wolfboro, and she's proud of her son, and I'm proud of her son, and I will always wear this bracelet to try to make sure everybody remembers not only Matthew Stanley, but all those other brave young men that never came back. Well, I was escorting a delegation of United States senators, two of them being Gary Hart and the other Bill Cohen, and we were going to China, and we stopped in Hawaii. The man the admiral who was commander-in-chief in the Pacific, my father's old job, was very friendly with Cindy's father, Jim Hensley. So they were having a reception for the congressional delegation, invited Cindy and her parents, and I was there, and that was where we first met. Interesting. Well, our wedding was in Phoenix, Arizona. It was very nice. We had all of her friends, a lot of my friends, including Senator Gary Hart, including Senator Bill Cohen, came out for the wedding, so that was pretty neat. And it was just a very nice occasion, and it went extremely well, and I'm very happy that so many of my friends and her friends came from all over the world to be there. Since I was still in the Navy and doing my job as the Navy liaison officer to the Senate, we came back to Washington, had a home, and then there came to be a crucial point whether I was going to be able to stay in the Navy or not and maintain flight status. I was unable to maintain flight status. That puts a ceiling. And I had to make a tough decision, and I decided that since I was not going to be able to reach all the heights that I wanted to, that I'd get out of the Navy and that we'd go to Arizona and go into her father's business and enjoy life. It was the end of my rootlessness, and it was the beginning of me having a place that I could really call home. And Arizona is a magnificent state, as everybody knows. It's diverse, it's magnificent, it continues to grow, and it's a great place for opportunity. So I was very happy to come back to come to Arizona and live, and I've loved it ever since. Well, my father achieved 4-star status, which is really the highest level you can reach. He was commander of the largest force in the military, commander-in-chief in the Pacific, and yet after he'd done such a wonderful job, he didn't want to retire. He just didn't. He loved the Navy so much. He came to the Naval Academy when he was 16 years old, and all he knew in his life really was the Navy, and so he was not happy about having to retire. But after he'd retired and got together with his old buddies down at the Army-Navy Club and stuff like that, he got a lot better. It was just tough for him to leave what he had known his whole life, and frankly, that happens to a lot of us. I did feel pressure from the time I was very small to do well, to succeed in the Navy. I had famous father and grandfather, and all the way back, as I said, to the Civil War, our War of Independence. I mean, it goes way back. So I felt the pressure to succeed, and I think that was part of that instilled the rebel without a cause in me. But I didn't think about it in the context of living up to them as much as I was living up to the tradition, so to speak. Well, when I left the Navy, it was really nice. We had a nice reception there, and a bunch of the senators came and that I'd traveled with and spent time with. And it was at that time that both Gary Hart and Bill Cohen both said to me, you ought to look at going into politics. You ought to look at the political scene and see what it looks like. And I, of course, did not think that much about it. I had been exposed to the political environment working in the Senate. So I was certainly interested. I was certainly saw what a hard-working young senator like Bill Cohen or Gary Hart could accomplish, a lot. And so that kind of got my interest in it, but I really came back in order to go into my father-in-law's business and be a businessman and, do all the things that they do. But once I got here, and was that people like Bill Cohen contacted Barry Goldwater. I had gotten to know Barry in the Senate, and Barry said, you ought to think about running for office. There was a House seat that came open. So there was a lot of people who knew me from Washington who were sort of putting pressure on, or not a pressure, but encouraging me to get into the political arena. And I had gotten addicted because of those years I spent as the Navy liaison officer in the Senate. In the Senate, there's little offices down in the basement of the different services. And they're the ones that handle the travel for senators, or they handle cases for them. They have a constituent that got thrown out and they handle issues with them when they are interested in whatever, for example, the Senate Armed Services Committee legislation. And so you do a whole lot of things. But one of the things that you do, which is of benefit, is you travel with these senators on various trips, and you go all over the world. I went everywhere. I went everywhere with John Tower. John Tower, who I was very close to, really kind of took me to raise. And sometimes it would be just me and him traveling to Egypt and to Morocco and to wherever it is. So that's where I really became familiar with the Senate and how it works, is these travels that I went on with the various senators. And I learned one heck of a lot. I just have always had a sense of urgency, a sense that you better do what you can while you can. I'm not sure if it has to do with some past experiences where I've seen awfully good young men leave awful early. But I have had, and it's not all good, I've always had a bit of urgency to fill in that square and take another one. A good example, when I came back to Arizona with Cindy, it became known that Barry Goldwater was going to retire some 2 years, 3 years later. Yeah. And so right then, I started positioning, as soon as I was elected to the House, I started positioning myself for running for Barry's seat in the Senate. And I didn't make a lot of bones about it. So I was always looking the next step down the road. That's good, and it's wonderful, and it's successful, but the downside is that sometimes you don't stop to smell the roses. I've been tested on a number of occasions, as any politician has. I haven't always done the right thing. In the case of the Confederate flag in South Carolina, when I was running for president, where I said, well, it's up to the people of South Carolina. It's not up to the people of South Carolina. It's up to the people of the United States of America. And when I said that, I was basically a cop-out. And it didn't gave me a single vote, by the way. So what I learned over these experiences, it's a tough decision. Do the right thing. If you do the wrong thing, then you will pay a price for it. And I have been gifted, thank God, and we can go back to Mr. Ravenel and the Code of Conduct back in high school, but I always know what's the right thing to do. But I haven't always done the right thing because of my political ambitions, and every time I've paid a price. There was an individual here whose name is Charles Keating. He was a very big builder. He was probably at that time the biggest in Arizona. He also was very patriotic, and he took a liking to me, and he helped me with my campaigns, and he helped Republicans and Democrats. So I got to know him very well. Then there was a case where he got in trouble with the housing authorities. We won't go into the details, but he got one of the other senator from Arizona to set up a meeting with several senators, John Glenn, Dennis DeConcini, me, there was a couple others, and we met with the regulators. And I was told, hey, we're going to meet these regulators, let's all meet with him. And frankly, I didn't think much about it. But we came to this meeting, and it became what was pretty clear to be an improper pressure on these individuals. In fact, there was several times, well, you have to, or you need to. And frankly, these regulators didn't like it, and they complained about it, and it got in the media, and there was a congressional investigation, and I was found guilty of bad judgment. That is true, but others, there was much harsher verdicts, but that will always be somewhere a black mark on my record, even if it was only using, quote, bad judgment. It was wrong. I think it was that I saw things that I didn't agree with, that I thought was wrong, like pork barrel spending. When I see earmarks that helps a certain industry or company in that senator's hometown or state, then I think it's wrong, and I get angry about it. And so I worked with Russ Feingold on campaign finance reform. I've worked on all kinds of different reforms because I think that we have an obligation. So sometimes in my zeal, I would get angry. Now, a lot of that faded over the years with wisdom and age, and I still fight like hell with people, and I really argue with them, but I don't get personal. I just have strong conviction when I think something is before me. And I think that the result of that was the other night when I gave the speech, and every single senator in the United States Senate, every one of them in the United States Senate, came over and either shook my hand or hugged me. That was a remarkable moment. Well, that's true with a lot of friends of mine in the Senate, but we all know that Ted Kennedy was a unique figure, and he and I used to fight. I can tell you that we'd fight and we'd argue. If I could just tell one story, one day I was walking by the Senate. I saw two young senators in a fight on a parliamentary issue, which neither one of them understood. I went to the floor and I started arguing, and who comes out of the cloakroom but Ted Kennedy? Pretty soon, the freshmen have fled the floor, and Ted and I are nose to nose arguing, breaking all the rules of the Senate, and we finally got it resolved. Walked off the floor together, and he puts his arm around me and said, hey, we did pretty good, didn't we? That was the essence of Ted Kennedy. And he had a personality. He had a larger-than-life personality, so that he was a lot of fun to be around. He and I used to socialize a fair amount because he was a fun guy to be around, and he had a million stories. That's one thing I guess happens to us with old age. But we became very close friends. And when it came time for the Profiles in Courage Award, I could not be more honored, not only for the award, but for the person who really was the one responsible for me receiving it. I've received a lot of awards, and I'm not diminishing any of them, particularly my military, because that's different from, but I'm really most proud of the Profiles in Courage Award. And I just made every person who ever gave me an award very angry. I apologize. Ted and I developed a relationship where I could just walk in his office or walk up to him and start talking, and we would do things. Armed Services Committee, he was a very contributing member on the Armed Services Committee. We got a lot done there. And I'd like to tell you that all 100 senators get a lot of things done. That's not true. He and some others, beginning with John Tower and others, as I watched them succeed, I began to change more and more and more. And still, though, I'm still a flawed person. I still will get angry. I will still yell at somebody. But it's also at the point when I yell at somebody, they just say, and that's just John, and move on. Some of those that I have had some of the fiercest verbal battles with, among the first that came up and gave me a hug the other night. I thought that was really touching. It kind of struck me because he fought it and he had it, and also Joe Biden's son. There is something there. There really is something there. And the last time I saw Ted was they brought him from the hospital to cast a vote in the Senate, one of these. And Ted came on the floor, and I didn't see him, and I was leaving. And as I was down where the entrance to the Senate, I looked over and I saw him getting into his car, not very easily. And I heard this voice, "Oh, John," And I went over and gave him a hug, and it was really touching. "Oh, John. Oh, John." Yeah. Every senator has a hideaway. He had a hideaway. And in that hideaway, where I used to go all the time because we were doing immigration reform, Ted Kennedy was like a museum. So he would take one of these freshman senators, Republican or Democrat. They would come in. They would show him a picture of his brother, the one that was killed in England in that mission with it was basically suicide. And then he had pictures of the boat. Then he had pictures of his sister. And then he had pictures, and he said, "And this is my sister Rose. Now she was," And I'm telling you, after about 15 years, whatever Ted wanted, he was going to get. It was fun to watch. I never felt endangered, but I have felt over the years an intensity of the anger and the more of these kinds of emails and letters that are just pure hatred. There's a lot of people in politics I don't like and I don't have a lot of respect for. There's some, but I've never hated anybody. I didn't hate the Vietnamese. I mean, there's an illness out there, and I hope that we can, which was really one of the major subjects of that speech the other night, we got to stop that. We got to sit down and work with one another. I told you the story of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. I told you the story of many others that they sat down together and got things done. What have we done now, past Gorsuch? I did spend a lot of time on a lot of issues working with Bob Dole, who was our leader. He had a very strong affection for me. So I think obviously when you're the major speaker that it certainly gets people's attention, especially those outside the party. I think it was a seminal moment. I really do. I think also another seminal moment was nominating Bob Dole. Real quick story. I was walking along, my cell phone rang, I answered it, and I heard this, and I said, "Hello," and he said, "What's up?" And I said, "Nothing. How are you, Bob?" He said, "Okay." He said, "How's it going?" I said, "Well, I thought Elizabeth did a great job last night. I think that things are going fine. Will you nominate me?" I said, "What? Will you nominate me?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's tomorrow night." He said, "Well, you better get busy." Click. So that's my process of giving the nominating speech for Robert Dole. It was a classic Bob Dole. And by the way, another thing about Bob Dole, and I don't mean to wax too off the subject, but when I saw him and Dan Inouye together, there was something magic. Both of them wounded, both of them in the same hospital, both of them had a bond that was just very touching. And I visited both of them, and I visited Dan, and Dan and I he was the chair and I was the ranking member on the Indian Affairs Committee. He was a man of dignity, and it was very touching when we honored him after he passed away. I was a big follower and still am. My role model is Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt really got his start as a reformer. He took on Tammany Hall and he cleaned it up. He called them the malefactors of great wealth, and he was a reformer. That's really how he got his claim to fame, that and his Western activities as well. So when I see and still see the influence of money and the way it changes votes and changes priorities, and I'm very unhappy about it. I'm very unhappy when you see a certain interest being able in various ways to contribute huge amounts of money, which then changes the outcomes of elections. And that has happened. So Russ and I got together, and by the way, he's just as honest a person as you'll ever know. And we came up with our proposal, and we got it done through the Senate, and in the House we got it done, and it was a real good accomplishment until, as you know, the Supreme Court basically voided a significant amount of it to their everlasting shame. And by the way, there will be more scandals. There's too much money washing around the American political scene today, and it is the source of also all cynicism amongst young people. I think young people see the system and they see all this money washing around, and they see their priorities, which do not have a lot of money behind them, either disregarded or not given the priority that they think it deserves. And they don't like it, and they think it's wrong, and they think they are being left out. That's why you're seeing the millennials acting in some ways that shouldn't surprise us, but they are very, very active, and they will get more active. It was something that evolved. You know, I went to the House, and then I was in the Senate, and then was involved in all of these issues, and involved in people said, you know, you ought to run, and we looked at it, and the normal process sort of that you go through, and we decided that in 2000 that it was doable. And so started with New Hampshire and did extremely well, and you know, about South Carolina and other parts. But it was a great experience. When I begin to indulge in self-pity, which I do from time to time, look, how could a person like me have an opportunity to run for president of the United States twice? It's amazing. It's amazing. And as I look back over those years as we described them, it's amazing. I'm still startled that I was able to get done all the things that I've been able to get done. And I also remember the failures which I was not able to get done. You know, I've always liked George W. Bush. He's a fine man, and he's a good guy. And when the campaign was over, it gave me a couple of weeks, but then I pledged to do whatever I could. But the campaign in South Carolina was really not honorable. And I'm not complaining. It is no point in complaining. But when you send out thousands of phone calls saying, do you know the McCains have a black baby? When you say that McCain wants to take the flag down, when you say there's all these things out there that he was able to buy with money. Now, again, when I look back on it, I'm proud of my campaign, and there's no sense in me beating up on George Bush or Karl Rove. But the fact is, that is a campaign that I wouldn't have been proud of. We have a daughter from Bangladesh, Bridget, that Cindy brought home from Mother Teresa's orphanage. Mother Teresa basically made her do that, and obviously she is Bengali. And so we're proud and love our daughter, and so the phone calls went out all over South Carolina. Do you know the McCains have a black baby? And that's just, you know, we were at a quandary, too, as to how to respond. We had two choices. Go ahead and run the campaign and probably lose, or get into some kind of mud-throwing contest. And we talked about it, we talked about it, we talked about it, and I just finally said, look, I can't, you know. And it's not that I'm the knight in shiny armor. I've done things I haven't been proud of. I said that the flag, Confederate flag, should still stay over the state capitol in South Carolina. I've done lots of things, okay? So I'm not painting myself as a knight in shining armor at all. But in that particular case, it just, it's those kinds of things that the best thing to do is not think about it. I left the race, and because we had run a good race, and that one that people could be proud of. But also, the best cure for losing is get to work, get busy. As soon as we came down from the airport overlook up there in Sedona, I sat down with these guys. I said, look, okay, I'm going to take a couple of days off, but we got to get to work, because that's the only way to get over this. So I redoubled my efforts and my energies, and also I gained some seniority in the Senate as also, and so I really worked as hard as I possibly could, which is the best way to do it. You know, sometimes, once a blue moon, I'll wake up and think about one of the campaigns, and I'll say, come on, go back to sleep. I think the campaign in 2008, first of all, obviously was not a primary. We succeeded in the primary. And second of all, I think the environment was much more toxic than it was in 2000. There was more hatred, there was more anger, there was more things floating around the internet, like, accusing me of all kinds of weird things, meeting with ISIS, things like that. It was, therefore the campaigns themselves became more toxic. So therefore the personalities. I have always admired Barack Obama, and I refrained from attacking him personally. I did point out, as strong as I could, that I disagreed with him, but I believed he was an honorable man. But the whole environment, including the media, was much less, let's examine the issues. That the boys on the bus was not there. And I wanted to bring the media back on the bus. I wanted them to be there and have the same dialogue we had before. But they'd get on the bus, and then it would be a challenge as who can ask the worst gotcha question. And I thought, hey, gang, I'll tell you whatever you want to know, but let's not. But it didn't succeed. I'd also point out that, and there is no excuse for losing, but when the stock market crashed, we went from 2 or 3 points up to 4 or 5 points down. I still believe that Barack Obama would have won anyway. I also believe that he ran a very good campaign, and he's a very good campaigner. But I think it might have been a little closer if it hadn't have been for the stock market collapse. But who cares? I lost, huh? Maybe some bespectacled scholar will like to look that up and see how much McCain lost by. Yeah, it was a big change, and it was very disappointing to me in many respects. I hate to even talk much about it or think much about it, but I remember I got on the bus one time, and one of the questions was, what do you think about the economy? And I said, well, I'm working hard on the economy because that hasn't always been my top priority, armed services, et cetera, et cetera. The next day in the New York Times, McCain said he's not familiar with the economy. It was that kind of stuff that got so frustrating that then the reaction is your press person says, send me a written question, we'll send you a written answer. And I've had people like John Dickerson and Jake Tapper and a lot of people that said that campaign of 2000 was the most enjoyable experience of their lives because we did have fun. We joked, we laughed, but we also were serious on the issues. But they didn't try to stab me in the back. a disease that can only be cured by detoxification or death. I think that once people get that ambition, that they have to go through it one way or another. And one of the saddest things to see is sometimes they won't let go when they should have let go long before. It's a heady environment. It's a incredible area of responsibility that you're competing for. But it's also a chance to get to know America like nobody else could ever do. I mean, I've been to places that I would never have gone to ever in my life, and they've all enriched my life. Well, I try not to admit to all of them, but I think the only way you can put these things behind you is to understand you were wrong, to admit that you were wrong, and then move on. And the only way you're going to learn is to say, I was wrong in not saying the flag, the Confederate flag, should come down from on top of the State House in South Carolina. Now, every time something like that has come up or like that, I've just, because I'm not going to make those mistakes twice. But I also think that when you don't admit you're wrong, then you're going to make them the same mistakes. And I've made a lot of mistakes, but I've also had an incredible ride. I was persuaded by my political advisors that it would be harmful. And that was another mistake that I made. I should have said, look, we've got a hell of a campaign anyway. Joe Lieberman is my best friend. We should take him. Now, that is not anything against Sarah Palin or anyone else. It was that this guy and I are like brothers. And I thought I could do best with him. But after that was rejected by me, the final vote, then we started looking around at all the others. I think there was a lot of negatives on Sarah. I think a lot of it was uncalled for. I think some of the things that were said about her, including on late night shows, were cruel. And I think she was loyal, and I think she worked hard, and I'm proud of her. And I wish her every success. And I will always treasure her friendship and her family. She's not the reason why I lost that race. Feeling fine, plenty of energy, eating right. The doctors say that I have a constitution that is really, really tough. And so I've not had any side effects of that treatment, I'm happy to say. I think all of us think about death, particularly when you're going through something like this. But I think more about life. I have lived an honorable life, and I am proud of my life, despite a number of serious mistakes. So I'm very proud to have lived, and I want to celebrate that. And I don't want to worry about dying. Dying happens to all of us. It's not about dying, it's how you lived. And I want to think about how I lived, and I have some reasons to be proud. It's not that I'm sure I'm going to heaven, don't get me wrong, but I think it's another chapter, and it happens to all of us. I think it was Thornton Wilder that said, I always knew that nobody could live forever, but I thought there might be one exception. So sometimes I think about Thornton Wilder. He served his country. He served his country. 4 words is what I would like to say. And by the way, my closest friend, Naval Academy graduate, 4-star admiral, superintendent of the Naval Academy, had 2 plots on a hill overlooking the Severn River, reserved, one for him, one for me. He's there now. I always am optimistic about America because I believe we're the strongest and best nation on earth. But I think we're going through a period of great peril. at the end of World War II, a new world order was established. Free elections, freedom of the press, all of the things about democracy that made it also the most prosperous period the last 70 years in history. Now we're seeing that eroded. We're seeing rights taken away. We're seeing the rise of radical religions. We are seeing a disregard for the basic human rights. And we are also seeing a weakness in the United States in our leadership. For the last 70 years, every time there was a crisis, whether they should have or not, they looked to the United States of America. That's not going on so much today. And so I still believe we can surmount all these obstacles. I believe we can contain Mr. Putin. I believe we can defeat this radical form of Islam. I believe that the Chinese, all of those things we can handle, but we're going to have to exert ourselves in a way that we haven't recently. My grandfather loved his life, and he loved the fact that he had to leave. My father the same way. I am the same way. I love life, and I want to stay around forever. But I also believe that there's a great honor that you can die with, and that's what I want to do. These doctors keep talking to me about people who, if you tell them the truth, then they just give up and die, that you really want to, and I keep saying to them, just tell me. Just tell me. That's all I want to know, you know. Some say, well, it's not good, and I say, well, you know, it's just and it really drives me crazy. But then I talk to other doctor friends of mine and say that most people, that's not what they want to hear. Why wouldn't they want to hear, you know? Why wouldn't they want to spend a few more days here? And my old friends that are still left, it's interesting how they've all kind of turned out in different ways. And I'm sorry to say a few of them have gotten angry and bitter. Why? You know, why? But some of them were still close buddies, and I hear from them every day, and they send me emails, and they say, why didn't you, or why did you, what is the matter with you? You know, it's great. It's great to hear from them.